This is Danielle Citrin. I'm a law professor at the University of Virginia School of Law and the vice president of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. And on the anniversary of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative's 10-year anniversary, I'm sitting down in a conversation with Dr. Marianne Franks, the president of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and Dr. Hani Farid, a board member of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. We're going to talk about CCRI, where it began, how it began, the history of the work that we've been doing and doing together. And before I dive in, I just wanted to make sure that we all understood sort of a little bit more about Dr. Franks and Dr. Farid, which is, so Marianne Franks is a law professor at the University of Miami, and in, I think, 2 months will be a law professor, is joining the faculty of GW Law School with a distinguished, very fancy title role that I'm not going to get
long.
right, and was from the beginning CCRI's tech policy and legislative director, and one of the founding members of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and has a doctorate in philosophy, and so draws on that work. In doing your own legal scholarship. And next, so Dr. Hani Farid is, as I always say, and you cringe, I think, but it's, I think, fair to say, is the, I know, forgive me, is the father of photo-DNA, which seismically changed the phenomenon of child sexual exploitation material and its visibility and preventing the re-upping or re-visibility of child sexual abuse material. You're also a professor of computer science at Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and you have a very fancy title too, and joined our board of CCRI, sort of began working with us in 2018 and joined our board in 2019. So it's such a gift. You also are authors, Fake Images, The Cult of the Constitution, and soon Fearless Speech. So thank you so much for joining us to sit down and talk about CCRI's history, right? It's the 10-year anniversary.
It is.
It's a lot to take in if you think about it, right? Where we started and where we have come, but also, of course, all the work we still have to do.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess the first question is to describe the beginnings of the organization, where it began, what the initial goals were, and then maybe take us through a little bit, Dr. Franks, like where we went in those early days and that early work.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect 10 years on, right, that we've actually seen a decade of this work in this space. And to think back how all this started was really with an email. It starts with an email from a woman named Dr. Holly Jacobs, who is the founder of Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. But when she contacted me back in 2012, she was experiencing what at the time was being referred to as revenge porn. And what had happened was that there were intimate images of her that she never expected anybody other than her partner to see, had been splashed around on websites. They were being sent to all kinds of places and to people, her employer, her friends, her intimate partner. And she was looking for help. And she, in 2012, was going to lawyers, and she was going to the police, and she was going to anyone she could think of to say, this can't be right, what's happening to me? Yeah. And pretty much the response she got from everyone in 2012 was, this isn't a crime. What were you doing giving those pictures out? Right? You should have never taken those pictures. Mm-hmm. And so she has this struggle, these months and months of struggle where she's trying to plead with these websites that have her images, pleading with them to take them down, saying these aren't authorized, and just hitting, stonewalled at every turn. And so, as I like to say sometimes, Holly is so desperate that she starts to read law review articles. And she comes across a law review article that I had written about online abuse. Now, revenge porn was just a small part of it that I'd mentioned in this piece, but it was about the way that the internet can be used to harass women in particular and how this can impact their education and their employment. And she discovers that we're in the same city, so we're in Miami, and she thinks, well, I should just go and see this person. So we have this conversation, and the conversation, in short, was, if this is right, she wanted to ask, first of all, is it true that this happening to me, these intimate photos that I never meant for anyone to ever see beyond this relationship, are now out there in the public? Is it true that the law says there's no problem with that? And I said, unfortunately, in most places that is true. And she says, well, if that is true, then the law should be changed, and I want you to help me change it. And that's how it all started. And there was this moment where we delved into her vision for what she wanted this nonprofit to be, and it was really, I don't want anyone else to experience what I'm experiencing. I want them to have support. I want them to have resources. And I want them to live in a world where the law has changed and technology companies have changed and platforms take this seriously. And after, I think, the first conversation I had with her, I immediately put her in touch with you because I thought the person you need to speak to in addition is Danielle Citron. And we'll start thinking about how we can come up with some ideas here, because I had never done this kind of work. And when I say that, I mean, I'm an academic, and so I write articles that no one reads. And
Except for really crucially,
except one time.
That's not true.
Holly Jacobs. I mean, they do
Right.
read all of your work, but this
Well,
made
so-
such an impact,
Well,
right?
that's an
You think about it
unusual
that-
thing to be asked,
It is,
to say,
of
okay, so I've
course.
read an article and now I want to
Change the law.
operationalize it, right? I want there to be an actual statute. I want there to be lobbying. And I thought, I've never done any of those things. But what I had done was, I had several years of teaching as a law professor under my belt. And so I thought, well, why not try to come up with a model statute? People come up with model legislation all the time, and I could take a shot. And so having conversations with you about this, because Hanya comes into it a little bit later, but in those early years, we were promoting model legislation that says.
You want to tell us a little bit about how when you wrote the
Yeah.
model state law, you were blogging, which seems like ancient history now.
It does. Blogging
But you
seems
were
like ancient
blogging
history,
at
yes.
Concurring Opinions.
Yes, which no
And
longer
you-
exists.
Which no longer exists, but
Yeah.
was such a great blog
Yeah.
that we both participated in. And you put the idea out there
It did.
that here's this model statute, and we can craft this.
Yeah.
And we can craft it in a way that's narrow, that's clear, that's precise, that's consistent with the First Amendment. And what happens next? Oh, golly.
I was so popular.
You were radically popular.
No, so this is a blog that you were a part of, and that you had, I think you were one of the people who had invited me to guest there, and I thought this is a perfect opportunity to speak to a small legal
And this is
community.
2013, right? So like
Yeah, it's
we
2013. It's a long time ago, but it, at the time was a very well-respected blog. A lot of legal thinkers were either writing for it, reading for it, and so I thought, well, I'm going to put that out there and see what people think. And what they thought was, you hate free speech, you hate the internet, you are proposing something that is going to destroy free speech as we know it. And it's all because you want to protect women who've made bad choices. I mean, it was really like every
Yes.
trope you can think of right now, that it's basically the victim's fault, that the law can't do anything, that even if we thought this was sympathetic, the First Amendment would keep us from being able to do anything here, criminal laws are bad, all of these kinds of objections. And at the time, I think it never feels great, to have people just sort of pile on about an idea you have, but looking back on it, I'm really glad that this is the way that it happened, because it meant that we were very battle tested early on.
Totally.
So I took those criticisms, did refine some of the things that I put in the model statute, stuck to my guns though about the idea that, look, I teach First Amendment law and I teach criminal law. I know that it's not true to say that the First Amendment necessarily protects this, and that we have privacy laws that exist, and we can build on those things. And so yes, it was deeply unpopular at the time. It continues to be deeply unpopular with some people, but
And we wrote an article in 2014, or
did.
that came out in 2014.
that's right, that's right.
So we were writing and thinking, I joined you in this, and we wrote a piece called Criminalizing Revenge Porn.
Yes.
And we chose that not because we were enamored with the idea of revenge porn, but
So we had this discussion about
Yes,
this, right?
of
Like
course.
what to call this article, because it was going to be the first law review article that took this issue on.
Yeah.
And both you and I were uncomfortable with the term because it's a perpetrator's term, right? It's the kind of thing that you say when you're trying to insult the victims, right? But it was the term. So I thought, as much as we're uncomfortable with it, it probably should be in the title, because we need people to understand what this is. And then we will make clear in the article itself why that's a bad term for, at least two reasons. There are multiple reasons, but one, the biggest one from our perspective being that revenge is such the wrong way to think about this, right? Because revenge, first of all, implies that the person who's on the receiving end of this has done something that should be that you should take revenge for, but also wrongly assumes that people are personally motivated necessarily against the person that they're victimizing, because sometimes it's strangers and people who have no personal animus towards the person at all. But also, it was just not a respectful term in many ways about to try to capture what was happening here. And the porn term was tricky. Because we are talking about sexually explicit material, but as Hani well knows, the nomenclature over these things is so important because you don't want to trivialize and you don't want to misinterpret and you don't want to misframe, right? In the child sexual abuse material context, it took so long to get to that.
Would you speak to
terminology.
that?
You know what's so amazing about this story is my entry into the space is almost exactly the same. So back in 2005, somebody at Microsoft read an article that I wrote about detecting manipulated images, and on a whim called me to ask if I could help in their battle against what we then called child pornography. We now call child sexual abuse material. I didn't know anything about this space. I started learning about it, and I thought, wow, we should do something about that. So somebody reading my paper, one of 5 people who read it, same thing. We set off to doing it, and the same thing. We developed photo DNA, as you mentioned in the beginning. We got the same pushback. You are going to destroy the internet. You hate the internet. You hate free speech. Same thing. And then was the fight about the terminology. We never liked the term child pornography. By the way, God forbid that people used to use the word kiddie porn, which was particularly offensive. And we didn't like it because the then head of National Center for Missing and Exploited Children used to say, this isn't pornography. This is a crime scene photo. And I think words matter. I think it's what you said. It's a framing of how you think about this. These photos are evidence of a crime against a child. And so when we developed photo DNA, we got exactly the same blowback. You are going to destroy the internet, which, by the way, we didn't. I mean, the internet is terrible, but it's not because of us. And it was this, and so then when I started learning about your work, and I knew about you guys way before you reached out to me, it was, again, the same thing. I didn't really know about the space. I didn't know about, and I felt awful about not knowing about it. And so when you reached out, I was so happy to bring some of the expertise that we had learned in the previous 5 years in the child sexual abuse space. And the parallels are fascinating because it's all more or less the same problems and actually the same solutions. You need better regulation. Now, fortunately, the child sexual abuse space, that content is actually illegal. So we were working on a good foundation, but even then we were struggling, which tells you how hard these problems are. Like we couldn't get the tech industry, we couldn't get the tech industry to wrap their heads around 8-year-olds being sexually abused. How are they going to wrap their heads around adult women being abused?
And believe me, that's what they said because by the time we enter the space, and we're now trying to talk to companies, because one of the great things that comes out of the collaboration early on between Holly and Danielle and myself is part of the conversation has to be the platforms, because that's where a lot of this material is, and being indexed, right? Google is a huge player here because some of this material wouldn't, not that it would ever be harmless, but once you can put it next to someone's name and it becomes attached to them in a certain way for their search engines results, as you were saying, I think in hate crimes in cyberspace, that it's like a digital CV, right? It's something that everyone is going to know about you. We talk to these companies and they say, look, we're too busy cracking down on CSAM. That's a serious issue, right? We're talking about minors.
That's how they trivialize
us. And that was a lie.
Which
it was
is
a lie
amazing.
that they were cracking down. They weren't cracking down on
Right,
CSAM.
but that was their excuse to tell us why they weren't going to do anything about this issue, was to say because we're too busy doing something real. And constantly part of the pushback we got from lawyers and a lot of public defenders and people like that, and defense lawyers generally were saying, this isn't like a real crime the way that child porn is a crime. This is just women making bad choices. And so we constantly had to deal with the specter of how, as you say, it's very similar in some ways. It's obviously meaningfully different in the sense that a lot of what's being portrayed in the actual material is not a crime in the context of what we were calling at the time non-consensual pornography. But it was interesting that we had to kind of thread this needle around that issue that was casting this really long shadow. But yeah, so that was one of the key aspects of trying to figure out, how is this meaningfully different from, but also in some ways extremely mirrors in some ways some of these.
And I have to say, it was infuriating when the tech companies hid behind this argument to be ineffective in dealing with these real harms. We were furious of that.
So joining forces, I have to say, is so meaningful. Because we're all seeking together to, of course, protect privacy, protect against abuse of sexual exploitation, and to do it together is really meaningful.
Yeah, and to see how,
Yeah.
and to have the experience or the expertise that
Yes.
each of us brings into it to refine the project over these 10 years,
Yeah.
and to see what works and what doesn't work, and the kinds of arguments that you can make that will get traction and which ones won't.
Yeah, we almost can learn. There's so much we could have learned, though we tried the hard way. We were.
Well, I mean, we were pioneers in some ways, right? I mean,
Yes.
although we probably could have learned a lot more
I
if
wish
we had
we
to
could've-
earlier on, but
Can I say something? There's a lesson here too, and I've always been fascinated by this. But you were a group of what, half a dozen people who completely changed the way we thought about this space and the child sexual abuse space. It was about a half a dozen of us, and I'm reminded that you don't underestimate the power of a small group of people who are incredibly dedicated to change the world, because you don't need giant movements sometimes. Sometimes it's just a small number of people who are willing to lay down on the tracks year after year after year. And that's how change happens.
And I'm glad that you've mentioned that, because it is, I think, such a credit to Holly's vision to begin with, because
right.
I cannot imagine being on the receiving end of this abuse, right? You're living in it in this moment.
Yeah.
And at the same time that you are trying to figure out how to rebuild your life and to survive, you are willing to step in front of a camera and say,
And that was a
"This is who I
process,
am."
right? Recall like the kind of her self-negotiation, which she shared with us.
Yes.
Of
Should I go public? Should I not?
right,
Yeah.
that terrible, knowing the costs.
Yes.
Knowing if she comes forward in her new name,
Right.
that she's putting herself out there. And
Yes.
then
So we can't
wrestling.
remember, to remember
Right.
that she had changed her name legally because of this abuse.
Yeah.
And then she was going to come public, and that name was going to get attached to this.
Yes, and that's the
And that she knew
bravery
that
is-
every single time she came forward, someone else was going to be looking at her photos. And I will say, I'm a little ashamed to say that part of the reason why I agreed to help her was because I was shamed by her example, because I was insulated from this problem in a way that she just wasn't. This was happening
she's
to her.
really-
And I didn't want to get involved in some ways because I thought this is a deeply unpopular area to be involved with. I had previously done a lot of work as a graduate student on pornography and I didn't want to talk about it anymore. And it was knowing that she was going to put everything on the line for.
But you did too, my friend.
Well, I mean, I think
And can
part
I
of the
remind?
reason
Can I
why.
remind? Okay, go ahead. You say why,
Well,
but then
just
I'm going to
because it
remind
was-
us of the.
However
the
hard it
legal
was going to
story.
be, however hard it was going to be, I couldn't.
Yeah, I understand.
She was
Of
going to be
course,
putting
of
everything
course.
into this, and I thought I can't say no to this because of the sacrifices she's going to make. So, and I think all of us, though, in this effort, we've all had to experience the blowback from it because people get very angry about it, and it's not just the lone cranks out there; it's also it's lawyers, it is politicians, it is corporations that have gotten really upset and have made all of our lives really miserable. So it is. I wish that were not part of the story because this is, when you make this kind of change or you agitate for change, certainly people can disagree with it and think that this isn't the right approach or this isn't really an issue. That's one kind of response. The response of rape and death threats, or I'm going to find out where you live and I'm going to send people there to take. I'm going to have you sexually assaulted and I'm going to take pictures of it so that you will stop doing your work, which are some of the things that happen to some of us on the board. That is not an acceptable response, and yet that was the response.
That is the response.
Right, and that was just to highlight that was a real cost.
Yeah.
But we achieved some really important successes that I want to highlight.
Yeah.
So in 2013 or 14, as we were writing Criminalizing Revenge Porn, and we had your model statute in mind, we knew that was out there. There were 3 states that criminalized the practice of the non-consensual distribution of intimate images.
Yeah.
And that within, I want to say 6 years,
About.
we went to 47 or 48 states.
We're now at 48.
Now 48, DC and Guam.
And DC and Guam, and I think Puerto Rico.
Okay, so if you think it's
And-
more than
and
even
the Uniform
50.
Code of Military
Yes.
Justice as well, which is always a really important one to keep in
That
mind.
is.
So we've
That
gone
is.
from it's flipped, right? So it used to be this tiny minority of states that had laws against revenge porn, what was at the time called revenge porn, and now there's only a tiny handful of states that don't. There's only 2 states left that are the holdouts. South Carolina
Massachusetts
and
being
Massachusetts, if you're listening.
Right.
Yes, it's really shocking. But yes, within the space of 7 years or so, we saw the bulk of this happen, right? 35 or so states really getting with the program.
We
That
still
being
have our work to
said,
do, right?
Not all the laws are good, but the fact that there
Yes, of
was this
course.
kind of sea change, you're right, that we were up against really powerful forces because the tech industry didn't like what we were doing, and lots of really powerful politicians did not like what we were doing. The ACLU did not like what we were doing. They continue to not like what we're doing.
Yeah.
So, and this is all to say that there were really powerful, deep-pocketed resources that were ranged against us, and yet, as you say, looking back in 10 years to go from 3 to 48 plus these territories and the UCMJ, that's tremendous. And when we talk about the kinds of responses that Holly got when she was trying to get help, it's not that those things don't still happen, that we don't still experience victim blaming, but there's actually now a whole discourse that says, hey, it's not the victim's fault, it's actually the perpetrator's fault, and privacy is an important value, and we need to understand that it needs to be protected. And so much has changed just in the collective understanding of it. I think that yes, it's a real testament to the power of advocacy there, because yes, at the time of the celebrity hack, people were still just making jokes about how, oh, it's funny that Jennifer Lawrence's private photos are out there and everybody is sharing them. And when she tries to give an interview that says that's a sex crime and you shouldn't be looking at these photos, that she's mocked for that. I think the tone now is a lot different. It's certainly not perfect, but it has changed a lot.
I agree. I think one of the things that has shifted in the 20 years of this internet is that we used to think about the internet like Las Vegas. What happens on the internet stays on the internet. That there's no harm. It's just a bunch of pixels. And the reality is there is no more online and offline world. There's this one world. It's fully integrated. And online harms and offline harms are harms. Period. End of story. And I think we are slowly as a society starting to come to grips with that, in part because of the work that CCRI has done. And by the way, people should not underestimate how hard that is to pass laws in 10 years in 48 states. That's insane. That if you would ask me 10 years ago, I'd say you'll be lucky to have a handful of states. So a phenomenal accomplishment. And I think it also sets the grounds for the next line of harms and the next line of harms and the next line of harms, because now we have a scaffolding for us to think about.
We do, and it's so key that you are now part of our organization, because one of the things we desperately needed, right? Because we had law professors, right? Because law professors were joining in fairly early. But what we didn't have anybody who was a technologist. We didn't have anyone who really understood that aspect of it or understood it as an expert. And so discovering more about your work, not just with PhotoDNA, but I think the first time we met actually was at an event that dealt with deepfakes and the digital manipulation, which is, when you made reference to the next step, right? On the one hand, we have today, or we had 10 years ago, actual private photos that are released. And now we have, well, maybe there were no photos, but now it looks like there were, because it's really easy for anyone to create that. That's the next, this is one of the next forms of exploitation. How are we going to deal with that as not just as a legal matter, but also as a technological matter? And it was so good to have you, and it's so good to continue to have you to weigh in on this, because this isn't just a question about morality or about legality, it's also a question of the technology.
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, everybody now has exposure to non-consensual sexual imagery. Anybody who has an image of themselves online, which is everybody, can now be inserted digitally into sexually explicit material, and that material can be carpet bombed on the internet. And that is a phenomenal threat vector that is very different than it was 10 years ago.
And it really does, in some ways. I think we said this at the time, but it's so much more powerful now to say that when we were responding to the victim blaming, the idea of, well, just don't ever, the advice was don't ever take nude photos.
Now tell me what that excuse is.
Well, so what we said at the time was, this is wrong on so many levels. That's the new, you shouldn't have worn that skirt, to try to, in some ways, push the blame of sexual assault on victims. So we always held the line to say, that is not an answer. And by the way, for those people who are supposedly gung-ho about free speech, that's such a strange answer to give, because you're essentially telling people to censor themselves, right?
Shut up,
and that there's a punishment for their speech, right? So that was all a problem. But the other thing was, we were trying to say, the problem with misogyny and the problem with sexual exploitation is, you think, and you are trying to make a generation of people think that they can avoid it just if they're careful enough.
That's right.
The thing is, misogyny is a root cause, and if you don't actually confront it, it will find another way.
That's right. And it did.
And it did. So a couple years later, the next thing you know is that, oh, I never actually did share a nude photo, and yet, there I am, right? So now anyone can take, as you say, all they need is a profile photo from your Facebook page or whatever, or just any photo, and now it can look like you were in an intimate setting, or that you were engaged in some kind of sexual activity. And so there is no protecting you from that. So if we had taken this seriously, when it was happening to women that maybe people weren't being sympathetic to, we wouldn't be in such a big mess right now. We could have been better prepared to take on this new fight, which, yes, as you say, everybody can be a victim.
And some of that fight that we're doing at CCRI is law.
Yeah.
Some of that fight is working with companies, right? And using your technology in ways that relate to non-consensual imagery as well as fakery.
Yeah.
And some of that is just education that we try to do, right? And
Yeah, this is the approach that I think we in some ways pioneered, right? So that we had a law, policy instead of technology approach, which is to say, you know, we've got to have legislative reform. That's obvious because the law has not really kept up. But that also means that we have to think about the gatekeepers and the amplifiers.
Yeah.
So that's technological reform. We've got to get these companies to work harder on these issues, especially in the absence of any real legal incentive to do so.
Yeah.
And then we've just got to change hearts and minds about this, which
Yes.
is a big part of this because we want people to not do this to each other.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that is offer support to the people who are experiencing it. So our crisis helpline and our the safety guides that we have. And as you say, you know, we have that in place to try to deal with the deepfakes problem and the other kinds of issues that are evolving now to say we have to recognize that that's going to be a three-part process. It's
Yeah.
not just going to be law, it's also going to be technology, and it's also going to be society.
so with that, it's been an amazing 10 years. And I feel like I'm looking forward to the next
In a weird way.
in a weird way. But hopefully, I mean, there's so much we've accomplished. There's so much to do, and it's been such an honor to do it with you.
Likewise.
Likewise, yeah.